All right, hello once again. This is Jeff Scott of Rankin Technical College. And last Friday, which was about the 29th, I believe, of January, I neglected to turn on the tape player when I was going over Chapter 2 in our PDF text. So I'm going to redo it right now while I'm taping. So Unit 2 started on page 65, and as you notice, it's called Understanding Activities and Intents. All right, so in the chapter we talk about activities. You can look at an activity as being basically a screen. All right, and intents are the ways that we move from screen to screen or activity to activity, whatever way you want to talk about it. So as said here, an activity represents a single screen in the app with an interface the user can interact with. So what I envision us doing then, as an example, is we're going to go back to the BMI program and we're going to rewrite that using intents. We'll have 3 pages. And I decided when I did this, I've just to show this to you, I've created, I said I wasn't going to use human beings, but I decided, nah, I'm going to, but I'm just not going to use faces. So there was the obese, there is the optimal weight, there is the overweight, and there is the underweight. So you don't really see anyone's face, but I think that it'll be okay, and they're all 225 by 225 for their size, so that should work fairly well, or at least hopefully that's going to work fairly well. I guess we'll see when we get going onto it. All right. As mentioned there on the bottom of the page, although the activities in an app work together, each one is independent of the other. And there's a big reason for that. There's a reason that that is actually important. And that means that your app can conceivably open up activities or pages from other apps, and possibly other apps can do that with your app as well. And they give an example here where your app could, for example, show both a camera app and an email app, for example, and possibly even more than that. So typically one app is specified as the main activity, and that's one reason that by default, when you create your first activity, it's called activity main. All right, and it's the main activity.java file that goes with it, as they mentioned in here. And we'll take a look at some of this stuff as we get going, but it says there each time a new activity starts, the previous activity is stopped, but the system preserves basically what it is, where it is, etc., in something called the backstack, so that if you decide you want to go back to it, you're able to do so. All right. So the act of implementing or creating a new activity in an app, as it says there, you do the following. You create an activity, Java class, and there's different ways of doing this, but we'll look at a couple in just a minute. You implement a user activity, or a user interface, I should say, a UI for that activity, and you declare that new activity in the app manifest. Now, I could be mistaken on here, but I think that'll be done for us automatically. We'll see it as we go on. Okay, so first, create the activity class. Notice activities are subclasses of the activity class. Now, what I'm going to do here is just going to bring up, if I can find it, my latest BMI. So let's see, let's open an existing project here. And from the desktop, we have what? There's BMI, I think that must be it. BMI JPS, I'm going to guess that that's it. What you'll notice when you look at the main activity page, for example, is main activity extends app compat activity. Now, probably it would still work if I remove the app compat. I don't know if it would or not, but if I did that. All right. Now it says cannot resolve activity, but Notice as soon as I clicked, now it could, and basically I believe it added another import right there. Okay, now the reason that we don't use that, the reason that we actually use app compat activity in here is that provides a backwards compatibility, all right, for what we are doing. So they're showing here a skeleton class of the app compat activity, and let's just take a quick look, just so you see nothing up my sleeve, so to speak. But when we look right here, and we look at those 4 lines, let's copy them to the clipboard. Let's put them in here, and then let's just shrink this down so you can see. So there it is in the book, and here it is in our program. So what do we have? I didn't do the public class, but you saw that in there already. Override, protected void, onCreate bundle, saved instance, state, super.onCreate. So this is all stuff that you've already seen. This is all stuff that's in the program. So as mentioned in there, the first task is to implement the standard activity lifecycle callback methods. So onCreate is the one method, to my knowledge, it is the one and only required method in an app. Now there's other methods, and we'll see some of these later, things like onCreate, onStop, onResume, onDestroy, etc. And again, we'll talk about those a little bit later on in here. But as it says, the one required callback is the onCreate. onCreate is similar, not identical, but similar to a constructor that we've talked about in other programming languages. All right, it's typically only called once, and the reason that you have an onCreate is so that it can do whatever initializations you have to do. All right, so it says the system calls the onCreate when it creates the activity, and all the essential components should be initialized here. All right. You typically define the user interface in one or more XML files. Well, we've been using so far activity_main.xml. When we go in and we add another activity or two to our BMI application next week, what you're going to find then is we're going to have an XML file for each of those activities that we add. All right. As it says here, when the set content view is called, the system creates all of the initial views and adds them to the activity, and this is mentioned here. This is also known as inflating the layout. All right. And they talk about on pause, and they say that you may want to implement that as well. I'll let you go and read that. That's totally fine. So if the user interface for an activity is provided by a hierarchy of views, or is provided by a hierarchy of views, which controls the space within the activities window, and it responds to a user's interaction. The most common way of doing this is with the XML layout file. Nothing new there. As far as declaring the activity in the manifest, as it says right there, each activity in your app must be declared in the app manifest with the activity element inside of the application. We'll look at this in more depth and breadth of coverage when we go through and start making our changes to the BMI file in class on Monday. So when you create a new project or add a new activity, your manifest is created or updated to include skeletonized activity declarations. Okay, so this right now, again, let's leave this here. Let's go back into here. Let's go in and under manifests, let's open up this manifest file. All right, and let's look in the activity section. So right here. And if we look in there, now notice what we have. All right, we have activity Android name equals dot main activity, intent filter, action Android name equals Android intent dot action main, category Android name, Android dot intent dot category launcher, and then end our intent filter tag and end our activity tag. So the stuff that's shown in here is exactly what we have. And as the author says right here, as we look in here, the activity element includes a number of attributes to define properties of the activity, such as its label, icon, or theme. The only required attribute, as mentioned there, is the name. The name specifies the class name for the activity. Notice here it's main because we have a main activity. The activity element, it says, can also include declarations for intent filters, which specify the type of intents the activity will accept. All right. Well, this one has the intent for main and the launcher. So as it says, the filters must include at least one action element and can also include a category element. In this example, you see both. The main activity for your app needs an intent filter that describes the main action and the launcher. And that's exactly what you see right there. The action element specifies that this is the main entry point, all right, for the system. The main activity is associated. So if you want to come in and add more activities, I'm going to show you quickly two ways that you can do this. So you can come in and doesn't matter where you are, but I'll just go into main activity.java here. You should be able to go to File, New, Activity, and notice that if we bring up the gallery, that should look familiar to you. All right. But if we don't want to do that, we can do a File, New, Activity, and we can bring up the type of activity that we want, such as an empty activity. All right. Also, if you don't like doing it that way, because this is the way, for whatever reason that I'm used to doing it, is I right mouse click on whatever the package name is. So edu.rankin.jpscott.bmi_jps. I right mouse click on here and choose new and go down to activity. And you see it's the same thing. So either one, it's really and truly not going to matter the way in which you do this. We should get the same results either way. All right. So as mentioned here, when you choose an activity template, you see the same set of screens that we saw earlier. And when you create that, a Java file for that is going to be created with an onCreate method in it, and an associated XML file will be created. All right. We are going to do this together on Monday as a class. Okay. It says also an additional activity element in the manifest should be created. And I think, again, that's done for you automatically. But we'll see that for sure, all right, in class on Monday. All right. So all Android activities are started or activated with an intent. As mentioned there, an intent is an object that makes a request to the Android runtime. It basically is the way for us to move from activity to activity. All right. So when the app is started on the device home screen, the runtime sends an intent to start the main activity. It's the one defined with the main action in the launch and the launcher category. It's the only one that's in there right now. Now, in this chapter, we talk about intents. There are two types, and I've mentioned this before. I'm going to say it again to you, and that is when you talk about something being explicit, it's something you do, as opposed to something that's implicit, which, for lack of better words, it means it's something that's normally performed by the software. So the more explicit something is, the more control as a programmer you have over it. The more implicit something is, the less control you have over it as a programmer, because the more control you're giving to the software. Now, this particular section of the chapter that we're on right now, this section talks about explicit intents. In a little later section of this chapter, they will go into implicit intents. So you'll hear about both. All right. So an intent object, as it says, the key fields are the activity class, the name of the activity that should receive the intent. In other words, which activity do you want to move to? Next is the data. It may be that when you are going from one activity to another that you need to pass data. Case in point, let's think about our BMI program. All right, in fact, let's bring this up and let's run the program and look at it in its current state. I'm hoping this is the one, I think this is the one I've been using in class, so we'll see in a second. All right, so this is the way it looks right now. So I come in here and I type in 72, 71, and 111. I click, move this down, I click calculate, and you see that it comes up, and now that's underweight person. If I do it again, and I put in 166, now I've got an optimal weight person. I do it again, I put in 199, and I get an overweight person. I do it one last time, and I put in 333, and I get an obese person. Well, the way we're going to change this, all right, is this up till right here, this is pretty much going to stay the same. I might shorten this up a little bit. However, the image view that you see right here, and that's what that is. Remember, it's an image view. So the image view that's right here, we're going to put that or take that, and we're going to put that right here. We're going to put this into or onto its own page. Now, how do we know if we put 72 and 111 in here and it says, 16? How do we know if we're going to put this image on the other page, if we're going to have a new activity that's going to have that on it, how do we know that it's supposed to show an underweight image? Well, we're going to have to pass the status that's going to be in here over to the other page. Okay, so this will be created on a new page, but we will pass as intent data from this page to this page, whatever the status is. All right, and there's two ways that you can pass. You can pass basically a single piece of data or a group of data. All right, why is that important? Because what we're going to want to do every time we figure out somebody's BMI in here, we're going to want to keep track of the number of underweight people, the number of optimal weight people, the number of overweight people, and the number of obese people. And then we'll have a third activity that when we click to go to that one, it'll bring up those totals. So we'll have to pass those totals from this activity to that activity. All right, hopefully that made at least a little bit of sense. So, starting an activity with an explicit intent, again, this part of the chapter talks about explicit intents. So what does that mean? Well, the first thing you want to do is you want to declare an intent object. So here we're creating one. We're calling it message intent, so it's of type intent. It's a new intent. The context is currently where we are, and what we'll want to have shown is, in this case, we'd have another activity called show message activity, and we want to bring up that class. So we want to show that particular activity. Once you've set it up, you call start activity and you pass it that name. So as it says, the intent constructor takes two arguments for an explicit intent. The application context, typically you would put the word this in there. I don't know if you replace this with get application context, if it would work or not, but this is a lot less to type anyway, so let's just do it that way. And then the component to start. As it says there, then you use the start activity method with the new intent as the only argument. So whatever activity you start becomes the active or what's shown on the screen. And that stays on the screen until you do one of two or three things. Either you click the back button, or if you've got a button or something else on that screen to make you go either forward or backward. All right. Now, one way you can do that is to type in finish. And if you do that, literally, it'll just go back to the previous page. Now, I mentioned to you before that when you go through and do this, that it is possible for you to pass data inside of your intent, basically, so you can pass it from one activity to the other. All right, so as it says on the sending side, you create the intent object, you put the data, if it's one piece of data, or the extras, if it's multiple pieces of data, into that intent object, and then you start the new activity using start activity. So that's on the side, the sending side. Then on the receiving side, you've got to get the intent object and retrieve the data if it's one piece of data, or you want to retrieve the extras if it's multiple pieces of data. So they say here when to use intent data or intent extras. To my knowledge, you can always use extras, whether there's one piece of data or whether there's multiple pieces of data. You should always be able to use extras. But data itself, just data, is designed for a single piece of data. So when you know you only have one piece of data that you're going to pass, you might as well just use an intent data as opposed to intent extras, is what the author is saying here. Extras, on the other hand, as mentioned, is if you want to give a bunch of data. All right, so you want to put in more than one thing that you want to pass. So if you want to pass in more than one piece of information. Adding data is shown next here. I'm on page 71 of the text, and as mentioned, notice it looks very similar to what we did before, but you have to then add in the data. All right, so here's some examples of using set data, and we're going to get into all this in class, so I'm not going to go into it in much depth and breadth of coverage right now. I thought it would make much more sense to go over it as a class. So when you want to add extras, meaning you want to put in multiple pieces of data, typically, as it says, what you do is you can define your own intent extra keys. This is quite often the way it's done. They look like constants. Then you create the intent object pretty much the same way you did it before. You use put extra. All right, so when we did this above, we did set data, because data meaning a single piece, and put extra meaning multiple pieces of data. All right. And then on the other end, as they say, or alternately, I should say, you can create a bundle and you can populate that bundle. I've not used that, so I'm not going to go through that anymore. Then going at it from the other end, so going at it from the receiver side, or whatever you'd like to call that, when you start an activity with an intent, the started activity has access to the intent and its associated data. All right. As mentioned here then, so as mentioned here, it says to retrieve the intent, the activity has started, you use the get intent method. Again, it should come more into focus when we go through the entire thing. I believe at that time, I could be wrong, but I believe it's going to make more sense when we look at it that way. Okay, all right. So it is also possible to pass data back from an activity. So as an example, if with the BMI program, if I wanted, let's just suppose I wanted to do something on a second screen and pass data back to the first screen, you can do that. All right. And to do that, rather than using start activity to start your intent, you put in start activity for result. And when you say that, basically what you're saying is there's some information that I want to have come back with this. So as mentioned here, the start activity for result method, like start activity, takes an intent argument that contains information about the activity to be launched. Now, a couple things with this. Again, they talk about these request codes, but typically when you return the response, you want to double check and make sure that indeed it was sent. All right, and sent correctly. So you can come in and check different response codes, and they're shown here on page 74. Typically, result OK is the one you want to check for because that means everything was fine. Result canceled means that for some reason the user canceled the operation. I have not used the result first user to my knowledge, but as it says, you can define your own result codes in there. So it says now that the launched activity has sent data back to the originating activity, your first one, must handle that data, all right, if you want to be able to do something with it. Wouldn't make any much sense otherwise. So again, these three arguments, the request code, again, typically result OK, all right, the result code, and the intent data. So request code, result code, and then the actual data. All right. Activity navigation. Well, there's different ways that you can move back and forth between activities. It says there the Android system supports two different forms of navigation strategies for an app. The first is temporal or back navigation when you click the back button, and the second is ancestral or up navigation that you provide as an option in the app's action bar. And they go through how you could do each one of these in here. You know what the back button is already, so there's really nothing new in there. And with the up navigation, as it says right there, you can navigate within an app based on explicit hierarchical relationships between screens. Okay. Also, as mentioned, it's referred to as ancestral or logical navigation. Here on the bottom of page 77, implementing up navigation with parent activities. It says with the standard template projects in Android Studio, it's fairly straightforward to implement up navigation. If one activity is a child of another, you specify that activity's parent in the manifest. And they show an example of how you would do that right here. Now that's the end of the first portion of Chapter 2. And as always in the book here, they have links, and most of these links, I've mentioned this in class, are going to refer, not all of them, but most of them are typically going to refer to something out on developer.android.com. All right, so that's the first part. I'm going to keep going. I'm not even a half an hour in here. So, second part of the chapter, as mentioned, this is about the activity lifecycle, and I believe the third or last part of the chapter will be on implicit intents. So we just got done with explicit intents. So now we're going to talk, as mentioned, about the activity lifecycle. And basically what the lifecycle is where is the activity while it's running? All right, from the time you create it to the time it's destroyed. Okay? And they give some examples in here, but let's just take a look. This is a pretty good document here on page 80. All right? We already talked about the onCreate, which creates it. You jump in Onstart typically. Okay? If you have to pause, for example, then you want to resume. If you stop, typically you're either going to want to restart or you're going to want to destroy, meaning you're done. All right, so again, really and truly, I don't think there's a lot in here that's super new. Most of it just makes sense. When I start, where can I go? Well, I create, really all I can go to is start. All right, once I've started, if I need to stop or I need to pause, all right, I'll have to resume. So like I said, hopefully there's not a lot in here that it's not, that stuff that doesn't make sense to you. This activity created, we looked at this before. And as the author mentions here on page 80, the activity enters into the create state when it started for the first time. When it's first created by the system, or when it's first created, the system itself calls the onCreate method to do those initialization. We've already talked about that, or we talked about that much earlier. OnCreate, it says there, is the only method. It's the only required callback you must implement. So it's the only thing you have to have in your Java class. Now, quite often you have more than that, but it's the only one that you must have in there. So here is an example here on the bottom of page 80 that talks about the Onstart method. So you already saw this. We've already mentioned that after the activity is initialized with onCreate, it calls onStart. Then the activity is what's known in this is in what is known as the start state. OnStart, it says, is also called if a stopped activity returns to the foreground. All right, if you click the back button or whatever. It's called only once when the activity is created, but onCreate is only called once when the activity is created. OnStart can be called multiple times, depending on how often you start and stop your app. When an activity is in the started state and visible on screen, the user cannot interact with it until onResume is called. So you can see there's a natural progression here. There's things that happen during each state and things you can and cannot do during each state. Typically, it says you implement onStart in your activity as a counterpart to onStop. All right. So here's resume. So if you want, a good example of a reason you may want to use something like onResume and with pause, for example, is let's say that you've got a game that you're creating and you do allow the user using that game that she or he can go from portrait to landscape and back again. When you go from portrait to landscape or landscape to portrait, what's going to happen is the machine's going to pause. And then once it gets set and everything comes back, it's going to do an resume. So it says your activity is in the resume state when it's initialized, visible on screen, and ready to use. It's often called the running state. That's when, as it says, you're actually interacting with the app. The first time the activity is started, the system calls onResume right after it calls onStart. It can be called multiple times, though, if you pause multiple times. So you typically use onResume with onPause. The pause state, as mentioned here on the bottom of page 81, can occur in multiple different ways. First, if the activity is going into the background, but it's not fully been stopped yet. Second, if it's only partially visible on the screen, meaning something else is covering it. Or third, if you're in a split screen mode and some other activity in your split screen mode has the focus. Now it says here onPause should execute quickly. So you don't want to use onPause for CPU critical or CPU intensive applications, like writing data to a database or to a file or whatever, because it can slow down the app. The activity is mentioned here on the top of page 82, can move from the pause state into the resume state or to the stop state. When you're in stop, as it says, it's no longer visible on the screen, typically because you started another activity. Case in point, perhaps you were playing a game and your phone rang, and you're alerted that the phone's ringing, so you answer the phone. Then the game would typically go into a stopped type of activity. Now, depending on how this is set up, there might be things that you have to do when you're in a stopped activity. And, basically, again, as mentioned already, stop typically works with pause, okay? And as you're going through here and you're doing this, Why might you want to pause? Well, maybe if you're moving from one state to another, or maybe you've got a timer, maybe you're playing a game and your phone rings. And once you answer the phone, maybe the timer stops because maybe it's timing how fast you can go through and kill your enemies in the game or get through an obstacle course or do whatever. All right. Now, when the activity is totally shut down, you're all done with it, it's typically you call on destroy. All right. And as it says, once you do that, the activity instance is reclaimed by the system. So there's different reasons this may happen, and 4 of them are shown here on the bottom of page 82. You call finish in your activity to manually shut it down. You navigate back to a previous activity. The device's low memory configuration or a device change occurs. All right, we'll talk about that in a little bit. It says here, do not rely on destroy to save required data or activity state. Rather, if there's something you have to save, use on pause or on stop to do that. All right, there's also an on restart. As it says, it only occurs if the stopped activity is started again. It's called between on stop and on start. You might do this to set some resources or to whatever. There might be different reasons for doing this. Configuration changes. It says the most common form, it's kind of like what I mentioned before when you rotate your device from portrait to landscape or landscape to portrait. All right, the layout needs to change. While the layout's changing, you typically need to save the data that you've been working with. All right, activity instance state here on the middle of page 83. As the author mentions, when an activity is destroyed and recreated, there are implications for the runtime state of that activity. When it's recreated, the state of the activity and the user progress is typically lost, except for the exceptions that are shown there. First, some information is automatically saved by default. And second, the intent that was used to start the activity and its associated information remains available to that activity once it's been recreated. So, saving activity instance state, as mentioned here. To save information to the instance state bundle, use the on save instance state callback. So why would you do that? If you know that you're going to have some kind of a change that's going to take place, whether be it a device switching or something else, then typically what you're going to want to do is you're going to want to save information in this on save instance state. And the only reason I mention this on save instance state, if I jump back to here and we go to our activity main, we jump back up there. Notice at the top, down, not at the top, I guess, where are we? Right here, saved instance state. All right. So you save it in there, and here it's going to be called by onCreate, for example. So if you've got anything that's been saved, it'll be called and it'll be passed onto the parent of this. Restoring activity instance state here on the middle of page 84. As the author mentions, once you've saved the activity instance state, you also need to restore it when the activity is recreated. You do this either in the onCreate or in the onRestore instance state, one or the other. And again, some of this stuff, much of this stuff, you're probably not even going to worry about very much. All right. Sometimes certain things are also going to be done, for lack of better words, almost automatically for you. If you want more about this, notice if I click here, it says it's going to try to go out. And if I click allow, it's giving me this because it's got that Get Books thing, and I guess you've got to sign up for that. So, all right, let's jump back into the last part of the chapter here. And this is on implicit intents. Now, this is about 10 pages or so long. We talked about explicit intents already. what it's about, how it's used, etc. This, again, is on implicit intents. So we learned about intents earlier. We learned how to launch specific activities in the app with explicit intents. And in this part, or this section, or this chapter, as they call it, we learn how to send and receive implicit intents. As it says, in that case, we declare a general action to perform with the intent, and we let the system match the request with a specific activity. The example I gave at class for this, and I think it's a justified example, would be if you had something where you specified, I want to do something with social media, but it would be possible for you to do it in different ways if you have different social media mechanisms. For instance, if you had Facebook and you had Snapchat and you had Twitter, etc., you might end up with implicit intents bringing up a list of these where you could choose the one you wanted, or maybe even have the system choose it itself. So, bottom of page 86 here. Again, in a previous chapter, we learned about explicit intents. As it says, it's the most basic way of using intents to start an activity or other app components. But the implicit intents are more flexible. We don't have to specify the exact activity to run. Instead, as mentioned right there, you need to include just enough information in the intent about the task you want to perform, and then the Android system will figure it out and take it from there. Okay, so this is an example where, this is an explicit intent, so it knows that it's supposed to bring up the camera app, for example. So this is the example that you have, and then they say, for example, you have an app that lists available snippets of video. If the user touches an item in the list, you'll want to play that video snippet. Rather than implementing an entire video player in the app, you launch the intent that specifies play this object of type video, and the Android system is smart enough to start up the video player for you. All right, now what you're going to find in here is there are a lot of similarities between the external intents that we talked about earlier and these internal intents. All right, so as mentioned here towards the middle bottom of page 87, implicit intents, like explicit, are instances of the intent class. So as it says there, in addition to the parts of an intent we learned about earlier, there's also other things we can use, such as an intent action. Now, I do believe, and I'd have to check on this, I mentioned this in class, but let's take a very quick look. And I'm going to type in here, Android action done. Oh, where is that? Let's see. It says what happens here is edit text with a done button that closes the keyboard. So it says you can close the keyboard when you click done, and it says it seems like a simple task, right? Well, it may or it may not be, but this is an example of using one of those, and in here someplace is an action done. There it is. Right? We'll get into this and we'll talk about it some more as the semester goes on. There's a category which provides additional information about the category of the component. Notice that action starts with action underscore, category with category underscore, and the data type, which is the Mime type. And I mentioned this in class. And what is Mime type? All right, so it's multi-purpose internet mail extension. It used to be that you had to specify a Mime type. For example, you'd say that your Mime type was like text, JavaScript, or text, CSS, or whatever. And you don't as much anymore like in HTML. But as it says, the data type in here in this Android app would specify the type of data the activity should operate on. All right. As mentioned here, starting activities with implicit intents and passing data works much the same as with explicit. All right, you create the intent object, you add the information, and you do a start activity. All right, when you created an implicit intent object, you do not specify the activity or the component to launch. You do add the intent action or categories, or both action and categories. You resolve the intent with the system before calling start activity if you're not passing data back, or start activity for result if you are passing data back. And you show an app chooser, which is optional but is quite often done. And again, they go through the steps in here. We're going to do probably very little with this, to be honest with you. Okay, receiving implicit intents then, as mentioned right here, it says if you want an activity in your app to respond to implicit intents, declare one or more intent filters. Each filter specifies the type of intents it accepts based on the user's action, data, and category. Once your activity is successfully launched with an implicit intent, you can handle that intent and its corresponding data the same way you did an explicit intent, by following the four-step method shown right here, meaning you get the intent object with getIntent, you get the data or the extras out of that intent, you perform the intent requested, and you return the requested data. So again, here are the filters that you can work with. An intent filter may contain several elements such as an action, the data accepted, and the category. We kind of looked at this earlier. Here's some examples. This is pretty much the example we looked at earlier. Actions here on the middle of page 92, as mentioned, an intent filter can declare 0 actions or 1 or more actions. All right. They're defined in the name attribute, and it's action underscore something. Categories with category. All right, an intent filter can again have 0 or 1 or more category elements. Very similar to the stuff that we looked at before. All right, again, we're going to do very little to nothing. All right, very little to nothing with implicit intents. So I believe it's about the last thing that's discussed in here. Let me check quick. No, maybe not quite. We're coming towards the end. Sharing data with share_compat.intent builder. As it says there, sharing actions are an easy way to share items in your app with social networks and other apps. Although you can build a share action in your app using implicit intents, Android provides an easier way of doing it, and that is with share_compat.intent builder. When you do that, there are different methods based on that you can chain together and use with it. Activity launch modes. Well, what you can do in here is you can have one activity launch another activity. All right. So it says here, much of the time, the Android's default behavior for tasks and activities works fine, and you don't have to worry about it. But if you want to change what would be considered the normal behavior, as mentioned here, Android provides more than one way to manage tasks and activities within tasks. You can have activity launch modes, and as mentioned there, those determine how an activity should be launched. And you can have task affinities, which indicates which task a launched activity belongs to. All right. So as it says, you use the modes to indicate how new activities should be treated when they're launched. Should they be added to the current task, launched as a new task, etc. So to define a launch mode, you add the launch mode inside of your activity method in the manifest file. You'll notice, as they mention here on the middle of page 95, there are 4 launch modes that are available right here. All right, there's standard, which is the default, where new activities are added to the backstack for the current task. There's single top, as it says, if an instance of an activity exists on the top of the backstack for the current task and an intent request for that activity arrives, Android routes that intent to the existing activity instance rather than creating a new one. Single task, same kind of thing, but here if another task exists, it will route it to the activity instead. And single instance, which is the same as a single task, except it doesn't launch any other activities. All right. There are intent flags you can use here, and as mentioned, these specify how the activity or other app component that receives the intent should handle the intent. You'll notice that there are several intent flags you can use, such as flag activity new task, which starts the activity in a new task, flag activity single top, where if the activity to be launched is at the top of the backstack, you route the intent to that existing instance. Flag activity clear top, which says if an instance to be launched already exists in the backstack, destroy any other activities on top of it. Finally, flag activity new task, all right, which locates any existing instances of the activity in the task and brings it to the foreground. All right, we're making some progress here. Task affinities, as mentioned there, they indicate which task the activity prefers to belong to when that activity is launched. To define a task affinity, ask the Android task affinity attribute or assign it, add it to the activity elements, such as what's done right here. Often, as it says, these are used in conjunction with single task launch modes. That's it for this chapter. All right, in class on Monday, we're going to go over, before we do anything else, we're going to start by going over chapter 3 here, which is fairly short on the Android Debugger. All right, we're also, if I can find it here, where are we? Let's see. I don't know if this is it or not. I don't think it is. This probably is going to come up with an error, so let's say I can't find it anyway, but we'll see. This is not what I want here. So I don't want this one to be opened. I'm just going to hide this. And blank upload, name all my recent shared favorites. Okay, I won't start it this way. I think I've got Android PowerPoints. I've got a folder that's called that here. I don't see it, but I'm guessing it's there anyway, so let me pause for a moment. All right, so desktop. I had a thing, unless it was on the other machine, called Android PowerPoints. In fact, I thought I had a folder with .ppts in it. There they are. So where is this? Well, let's open up 2.1 or 2.2 and 2.3. Let's copy them over here, and let's double click and bring those up. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to stop right here and very quickly do one last presentation where, in fact, we'll do this in class. All right, I'll do it in class because we haven't gone through these yet. So we'll do that in class tomorrow. So that's it for me going over and redoing the Unit 2 material.